Someone with a heavy-duty pistol has got into this house and shot this sleeping woman, or a woman who's been woken up. Apparently, it seemed to the local police that she'd been changing a tyre on her car and somehow had crawled under the car and somehow it had fallen off the jack and crushed her to death. Now, I suppose that could happen. It's possible that a very bad man who robs places and kills people might also tell lies on the Bible. I'm Andrew Rule. This is Life and Crimes. This week, we resume the fascinating insight into the real dead housewives of Melbourne. Keen listeners will recall some of these stories we have touched on before. One that's very spooky and one that is still under investigation, and so we'll be very careful. This happened 40 years ago, 1981. A woman called Angie Jones, interesting name, German name, A-N-T-J-E, often called Angie. But Angie Jones was called that because she lost her original family German name when she married a fellow called Clifford Jones. And Clifford Jones was an older man. He, I think, ran a garage and service station in the western suburbs around the Footscray area. He was quite friendly with many local police. He made it his business to be friendly with local police around Footscray and the western suburbs, who in those days sort of ran their own race. Local detectives, ran their own patch fairly well, and it's suggested that Clifford Jones might have been somebody who was, pretty well connected through the motor trade. He'd worked for, I think, in the motor industry in an automotive factory. He had been involved in perhaps the disposal of spare parts and things like that. He knew a lot about spare parts and cars and all that sort of stuff. And it would appear that he knew people on both sides of the law, which of course is not a crime in itself. I personally know people on both sides of the law, and that's just one of those things. So we can't hold that against Clifford Jones too much. But what happened was Angie Jones decided to leave Clifford. In fact, she had left him, and she went to Queensland where she had their little boy, and she stayed with her parents up in the Gold Coast somewhere. And she had to come back to Melbourne in 1981 very briefly for some sort of minor court case. I think it was a traffic accident case, and she had to give some evidence. It wasn't much, but she had to come back from Queensland, stay with her brother in his house in St Albans and give her evidence, and then go back to Queensland where her parents were waiting with her little boy, who was, 2 or 3 years old, whatever. And she gives the evidence. She goes home to her brother's house. She meets up with old friends or whatever. And on this particular day, possibly the day before she was due to go back to Queensland, she's asleep at her brother's house, home alone, because her brother had a job and her brother's wife had a job and there was no one home. She's asleep at the rear of the house on a couch settee thing that was folded down out in a rear sunroom arrangement. Someone climbed over the back fence, and we know this because they broke a trellis or something and there were footprints or whatever, and someone forced the back door quietly, which didn't take a lot of forcing. It was just a plywood door. And someone with a heavy caliber pistol, I think if it wasn't a 45 or a 44, it was a large caliber pistol. Someone then shot Angie Jones at close range through the head. Now, this bears all the hallmarks of an execution killing. It's clearly what it is. Someone with a heavy-duty pistol has got into this house and shot this sleeping woman, or a woman who's been woken up by the sound of the person coming in. And it's clearly a premeditated murder. And yet, the head of the crime department at Russell Street Police Headquarters in the city, Superintendent Phil Bennett, known to everybody in those days as Fat Harry. Fat Harry was a large and jovial man who liked cigars, and he really liked meals and grog and stuff bought by other people. He really did love reporters and media people and anybody else, really, to turn up and pay for his meals and his drinking and to give him presents of bottles of whiskey and things like that. He was very friendly like that. But for some reason, he held a press conference and he said that the death of Angie Jones was probably a burglary gone wrong. Now, to the everlasting shame of the reporters gathered at that press conference, I don't know that anybody suggested otherwise, but it seemed to the young homicide squad detective, at least one of them, who went to that scene. This is a guy called Sal Perner. Sal Perner, it was almost his first ever job in homicide. He was a young copper. And he went to that scene and he saw the body and he saw the hole in her head, and or holes plural, and he saw the whole scenario. And he always knew that it was murder, and he always knew that murders by and large are committed by or for those closest to home, that many murders are in fact a version of a domestic incident, and that you start looking close to home and then you work outwards. And it seemed to him that they had to look very hard at the husband, Clifford Jones, and they did, and they were able to demonstrate that it probably couldn't be Clifford himself because he was at his service station several kilometres away, and that he, probably couldn't have driven home, done the murder and then driven away fast in time because he was provably at the service station at certain times, etc., etc. They knew that that scenario wouldn't wash in a court of law, and that they weren't able to put up a case that he'd shot his own wife, which leaves open the suggestion that somebody else did it for him. Now, they were never able to get any closer to making that theory stick because they just had no evidence. But many, many years later, and I'm saying 36 years later at least, I ran into Sal Perner at a Christmas function. By this stage, he was long out of the police force. He joined the racing authorities as an integrity commissioner, and we met at a mutual friend's, the great Jeff Wilkinson, who was a long-time crime reporter on the Herald Sun and on the Sun newspaper before that. And Sal Perner took me to one side. He said, "I reckon you should have a look at this Angie Jones thing." I'd never heard of it. I couldn't remember it. It stinks. It was never investigated properly. We couldn't really get to the bottom of it. Something smelly about it. Away you go. So just a few years ago, I did, and it may only be 3 years ago to be honest, I looked into it thoroughly and did what we could to reconstruct what was clearly a crime. And we won't pursue this any further, except to say that the cold case squad, which has just made the arrest for the Wollongata case, that same squad became very interested in the old cold case of Angie Jones, and $1 million reward was posted, I think with the intention of loosening the lips of those who might know who the trigger man was. And that investigation is ongoing. And that is why we will not talk about it anymore. But let's just say that the person that is thought to be in the line of fire is a well-known and feared criminal whose name has been in the papers in the last few months over other matters, over a very large robbery. That man who's under suspicion is also under suspicion for the death of his own first wife, who was a young mother with a child sleeping in the next room when she was shot in the head while she lay in bed in their house in the western suburbs of Melbourne. It's all a long time ago, but the police have not forgotten. And the police who have worked so well on the Wollongata mystery have worked very hard on these cases as well. Let's run through a few others. There is Anne Louise Crawford. Now, Anne Louise Crawford was the ever-loving wife, 35 years old, of an Essendon chemist called Ronald Crawford. And back in 1998, I think it was, Anne Louise Crawford was found crushed to death under a car in her driveway, or their driveway in Strathmore, in the western suburbs of Melbourne, near Essendon. And it looked to the local police who turned up that she'd been changing a tyre on the car in her good going-out clothes, with her hair done and her jewellery on and her rings on and her fingers manicured and painted with nail polish and all the rest of it, that this lady who lived in the suburbs where there's plenty of garages and all the rest of it, that apparently it seemed to the local police that she'd been changing a tyre on her car and somehow had crawled under the car and somehow it had fallen off the jack and crushed her to death. Now, I suppose that could happen, but it would be maybe a 1 in 100 chance. But nothing much was said about it. It just seemed like a lot of bad luck for poor old Ronald Crawford, whose wife had died, and their children, who were then motherless. It was very sad for them, awful. But Ronald was able to remarry, fortunately, and he moved, I think, away from Essendon and bought another chemist shop elsewhere in the eastern suburbs, and life went on. And a few years later, a career criminal in jail, a guy whose name we won't use, but he was quite a well-known robber and probably a bit of a hitman, serious crook. He's in jail and he's looking to do a bit of a deal with the authorities, and he said, you know, that this woman, Mrs. Crawford, the chemist's wife, was found under a car out at Strathmore X years ago. They said, yeah. Said, well, it wasn't an accident. I was paid $10,000 to do it and to stage it to look like an accident. And they said, that's very interesting. So they charged him, probably on the promise that he'd get preferential treatment if he gave evidence. And he gave evidence against the husband, Ronald Crawford, the chemist, and they were both tried for murder or whatever. And the said hitman was, I think, convicted because the successful defence of the husband, Ronald Crawford, and a very good defence by a very fine defence barrister, was that this wicked hitman, which he was a wicked hitman, he hadn't accepted money to do this at all. They said the defence of Mr. Crawford was that this wicked hitman had gone into a bit of burglary, which wasn't really his scene, and they said he'd been robbing the house when he'd come across Mrs. Crawford and he'd killed her somehow so that it looked like a crushing injury, and then he'd placed her under the car and jacked the car up and took the tyre off and made it look like the accident that it was assumed to be, and that he'd done this entirely of his own volition to cover up the crime he'd committed while robbing the house. Now, that was obviously a story that appealed to a jury, because the jury, after some deliberation, agreed that it was possible and that this man was a very bad man, and that it's possible that a very bad man who robs places and kills people might also tell lies on the Bible, and therefore they gave Mr. Crawford the benefit of the doubt, and he was acquitted. And our hitman, who used a code name or code initials in court, he was not acquitted. Then we have the case which we tackled recently of the poisoning case at Lockwood near Bendigo. That was of Rosalind Mcqueen. Rosalind Mcqueen, country girl, Swan Hill, goes to Bendigo, big city, rides the bus to work, falls for the bus driver who's already been married once. He ditches his wife and children, marries the young Rosalind. Rosalind has one child and is pregnant with another when mysteriously on April the 1st, April Fool's Day in 1986, Rosalind Mcqueen is found dead by a neighbour who has been asked to go and check the house by her husband Ray, who has called the neighbour on his telephone from his work in nearby Bendigo to say, I'm trying to ring Rosalind on the home phone and she's not answering. Can you go and check, please? Poor old neighbour, Vin McKenzie, who happened to be a friend of my father's, as it happens. It's a small world. He goes in and finds the pregnant young wife and mother, Rosalind Mcqueen, dead, and beside her is the little daughter, who's only 2 or 3. The poor old shocked neighbour is able to rescue the daughter, call an ambulance, call the doctor, call the police, etc., etc. A coroner, as we recently heard, found that there was probably a case to answer, that Mr. Mcqueen was the only obvious poisoner and probably had some sort of access to strychnine, which was a poison used on farms widely in the old days when Ray Mcqueen had grown up on farms out in the Wimmera, Mallee. But in their wisdom, the public prosecutor decided not to prosecute Mr. Mcqueen despite the coroner's finding that he probably had a case to answer. He, Mr. Mcqueen, interestingly, had been engaged in a torrid affair with a teenage girl who was their babysitter. And he had been purportedly engaging her as a babysitter and also teaching her tennis. He was a very good country tennis player who'd been well known out where he came from. I think he came from Beulah, out in where the Wimmera meets the Mallee. And he was good at tennis, and he'd been teaching this girl to play tennis. But apparently after Mrs. Mcqueen was found poisoned, the girl decided she didn't like being his tennis pupil or his lover anymore, and she gave him away for a bad job. And subsequently, he took up with an older lady, which was a good thing, and he married that third wife and currently lives in outer suburban northern Melbourne, the northern suburbs, with his third wife, and lives quite a normal life. I think he's a bit of a happy clapper who professes to be a Christian, but there are many people who believe that the coroner was right and that he poisoned poor Rosalind, his young and pregnant wife, because of his infatuation with a teenage girl. And that is the way that we will conclude our podcast about the real dead housewives of Melbourne. There are more where that came from. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is John Burton. And if you want to know more about these stories, links are in the description of this episode.